Hi guys, this is Hadi Atai at Baitab Iran. So, with the recent events unfolding, there's a very strong viewpoint that US is betraying Europe by selling Ukraine to Russia. But it's not as simple as that. In order to see who really betrayed who, um, you have to look deeper into history. As I said in my previous video, I'm not a big fan of Trump, but this needs a deeper look into what's going on. The world had just emerged from the ruins of World War II. Cities lay in rubble, factories silent, people were starving. Europe, which was once the center of global power, was now broken and desperate. Amid this devastation, two competing visions emerged for its future. On one side were, was communism and Stalin and Soviet Union. Stalin saw an opportunity. He believed that if he could offer Europe enough financial support, he could draw it into the sphere of communism, bringing, expanding Soviet Union westward. But on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, the United States had a different plan. It was George Marshall who wanted to implement this plan. Washington understood this that reviving Europe was not just an act of goodwill. It was a strategic necessity. We had a very weak Europe, hungry Europe, a tired Europe, a broken Europe, a Europe that was vulnerable to communism. If the US wanted to maintain dominance, it had to ensure that Europe's future was tied to American interests. So the Secretary of State back then, George Marshall, proposed the Marshall Plan, a massive economic recovery package that would rebuild Europe's industries, infrastructure, and everything, markets, you name it. And it worked. Within 2 decades, Europe's economy surged from war-torn ruins. It became an industrial powerhouse, and an industry evolved into technology, advanced technology that Europe was exporting. Europe and the US grew even closer. Modernism took root, and with it, Europe became indebted to the US, not just economically, but politically, and also militarily. NATO was basically an idea to protect Europe militarily. Now the US was Europe's gatekeeper. So, and also with NATO, we had a trade-off whereby NATO was provided to Europe in the exchange of Europe protecting US's hegemony. So, um, it wasn't just about money. The US became, Europe's military guardian through NATO. The alliance wasn't just about defending against the Soviet Union. It was about keeping Europe's from, tearing itself apart again. So we had the experience of European countries fighting each other to the extent of destroying every country on the continent. England was destroyed, Germany was destroyed, Austria, France, all these countries were destroyed. And another war could happen anytime. But NATO one of the NATO's jobs was to protect Europe from doing it again. There was also a price for Europe. Europe had to support the US hegemony. It had to align its policies, military interest, and economic strategies with Washington. So for decades, this arrangement worked. Came the collapse of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, we had the world with one single superpower. The US was at the height of its dominance, its economy thriving, the influence unchecked. So everybody assumed, the end of history. Francis Fukuyama wrote the book The End of History because uh, he thought that the US would be, the dominant superpower uh, forever. But you know who took US down from its dominance? It was Israel. And probably we can argue it was Netanyahu. With its plan to attack Afghanistan and Iraq, basically within 18 years or less, we had the 2008 financial crisis because US invaded two, it started two costly wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which was never in the interest of the US. It was in the interest of Israel. And within the end of history and the financial crisis was less than 18 years. Think about it. US could have stayed the superpower without any, opponent, without any deterrence, economically, militarily, technologically. US had everything to stay that way. But when you are influenced by, Israel, that's what happens to you. When you are allied with Israel, Israel will take you down. That's, it's been repeated time and time. What happened to Egypt? All these Israel allies have, gone down. So this happened. 2008 financial crisis happened. Uh, and at the end of the history, all of a sudden became the end of US market. So some people say it was miscalculation, but it was Israeli lobby that took the US down. Washington embarked on two, disastrous wars, spending trillions of dollars, weakening its global standing, destroying its soft power. You have to realize for a country to stay, to remain a superpower, it has to have soft powers in addition to hard powers. You have to have a strong military, but you have to have these values that you can talk about. Values that your citizens are proud of. But by invading, Iraq and Afghanistan, to a great extent, U.S. soft powers was destroyed. And it was the destruction of U.S. soft power was completed in 2024 and 2023 when uh, wholeheartedly supported genocide in Gaza, killing women and children. Now U.S. cannot talk about women's rights anymore. It's over. The U.S. Washington cannot talk about protecting children anymore. No one's going to forget what happened in Gaza. That's the soft powers that the U.S. once had is over. The U.S. cannot talk about freedom of expression. I remember when I moved to the U.S. in 2006, any talk that we went to, talking about, other countries, how U.S. is superior. One of the main things was, oh, we have the freedom of expression. We have the freedom of expression. But all of a sudden, this freedom of expression was gone because you criticized Israel, because the students gathered on campuses wanting the end to the genocide, wanting the end of support to Israel. Students were arrested. Uh, University presidents were sacked just because they allowed some protests to go on their campus. Harvard president was sacked. When I heard the news, I was shocked. I'm like, where is that freedom of expression that every US citizen was so proud of? Because you cannot criticize Israel. That's the fact. So US lost its soft power. So now in 2008, when that financial crisis happened, uh, China was growing. China was rising. It was uh, silently rising, and it was no longer just a manufacturer of cheap goods. China was becoming an industrial, technological, military giant. Huawei was leading in 5G. Chinese electrical vehicles are flooding the global market. Beijing was securing resources, strategic partnerships across Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America. This posed a direct challenge to US dominance. But the problem was that Europe wasn't willing to pay the price for containing China. Well, Trump saw this in his first term. In 2016, he imposed tariffs on China, expecting Europe to follow. Instead, Europe did the opposite. It strengthened its economic ties with Beijing. Companies like Xiaomi, Huawei, and BYD gained a foothold in Europe. Um, so Europe, continued to enjoy the cheap Chinese goods. Uh, Trump has started the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, but Iran refused to yield to Trump. Uh, it refused to yield to the pressure, and despite the Iran's oil production being not completely zero, but it went from 2 million barrels a day to 200 barrels a day. So there was a huge drop. Uh, Tehran stood firm. It did not, negotiate with Trump. Uh, then came COVID-19, which, not only reshaped political, basically geopolitical landscape, but also I think it was COVID that had a huge role in toppling Trump. It was an expected turn of events that gave China more room to maneuver. I mean, Biden did not lift the tariffs on Chinese goods, but it was a huge turn of events. Uh, so the question is, was Ukraine a proxy war with China? Biden took office with a clear goal. Like his goal was to bring China under control, but he faced the same problem. Europe wasn't willing to sacrifice its economy for an anti-China policy. The war in Ukraine changed the equation. While it seemed like a war between Russia and the West, Ukraine was also a battlefield for US China competing. Washington saw the conflict as an opportunity to weaken both Moscow and Beijing, but China, on the other hand, played very smart. It didn't spend a single dollar on the war. It kept buying cheap Russian oil while the US spent billions supporting Ukraine. Also, China watched as Europe struggled with economic instability, relying more and more on American military and financial aid. So Europe once again failed to, you know, shoulder its share of the burden. Now, recently in February 2025, we had the Riyadh meeting. Behind closed doors in Riyadh, the US and Russia faced a critical moment. Washington, what did Washington want? So Washington wants, like basically Trump wants a launch an economic war on China, and the key was oil prices. If prices dropped, China's economy would suffer, making its energy imports more expensive. So I guess the Riyadh meeting, there was a critical moment between Russia and the US. So what Trump and Washington want is an economic war on China, and the key was oil prices. If prices dropped, China's economy would suffer, making its energy imports more expensive. Uh, to make this work, the U.S. proposed a deal. Like, if U.S. released $300 billion of Russian frozen assets in exchange for a pivot away from China, then maybe Moscow would take it. Moscow had a dilemma. If it agreed, BRICS would lose its momentum. Russia and India, both BRICS members, uh, are already leaning towards Washington. If Russia could re-enter the global financial system, what incentive would it have to push for de-dollarization? So at the same time, China saw this trap. Beijing knew it couldn't afford to lose Iran as a strategic partner. So if Iran were cut out of energy markets, China's energy security would be at risk. So the question now is, where does Iran stand in this geopolitical atmosphere? So first of all, Iran has its own challenges. Iran can't sell oil freely due to sanctions, right? China is one of its, I think China is the most important uh, economic partner for Iran. 30% of Iran exports go to China. Also, Russia, which once needed Iran, now has alternative routes to sell its gas, through Azerbaijan and India. So both Europe and the US view Iran as an obstacle due to its stance on Israel. They're willing to pay a price to contain Tehran against Israel, I mean, to protect Israel. So, but Iran is not without options. As the US and Russia negotiate, as Europe drifts between dependency and defiance, Iran remains a critical piece of the geopolitical puzzle. It can still maneuver between China and Russia, securing its interest in a world where alliances are shifting faster than ever. The bigger question is, again, who betrayed who? At the heart of this global game, a fundamental question remains: who betrayed whom? I kind of answered this question. A lot of people can argue, you can easily argue that it was Europe that betrayed the US, not the other way around. Uh, so if you argue that the US betrayed Europe by forcing it into conflicts and economic struggles it wasn't prepared for, and reaching a deal with Russia behind the scenes, not inviting Ukraine. So did Europe betray the US by refusing to support its anti-China campaign? Or is this just the inevitable fate of an alliance in a world where national interest always trumps loyalty? So yeah, you can argue that there's no loyalty. Europe would, stay loyal to the US as long as it benefited. So maybe it's, the US and Europe are eventually drifting apart. because their interests do not align anymore as much as they used to. So, but one thing is for sure, the order that we had since World War II is breaking. We can see it. It's obvious that it's breaking apart. The next decade will be defined by who adapts best to the new reality. And in that game, there are no permanent friends, only shifting interests. So we have to wait and see. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Yeah, the geopolitical game is shifting very quickly. Things are, you know, the UK now wants to go back to the European Union. Trump wants to take over Canada and Greenland and Panama. These are major shifts that we would face them once in a while, maybe once in a decade. But right now, every 2, 3 weeks, we hear some news in that magnitude, which is, you know, unprecedented. Anyways, you have to be ready for big changes in the world order, and you have to wait and see what happens. Stay tuned. I'll come back with another one. Take care. Bye bye. Oh, by the way, make sure you like and subscribe. Bye.